You've entered void of rules, where chaos reigns and darkness consumes all. In this twisted realm where all laws have crumbled, only one rule remains, and those who break it are cast into eternal digital oblivion. The rule is simple. Subscribe. We're almost at 10,000 corrupted souls, but the void hungers for more. Our goal is 10,000 subscribers before this year bleeds into darkness. Will you join our legion, or face the consequences of defying the void? Now let's jump into today's story. My name is Ezra Thorne. For 17 years, I have been a keeper of voices that should have remained silent. I don't perform exorcisms. I don't banish. I document. I listen. And tonight I'm going to share something that has cost me everything I believed in. The room where I work is not an office. It's a converted church basement, inherited from my grandfather. Every surface etched with protective wards from 12 different faiths. My grandfather was a priest. My mother was a rabbi. My father studied texts the Vatican keeps in vaults 3 stories underground. I was born into this work. I never had a choice. 6 months ago, an entity I'd interviewed 11 times over 9 years made an unusual request. It didn't demand. It didn't threaten. It asked if I was ready to hear the truth. In biblical Hebrew, Abaddon means place of destruction. In Revelation, it's a name. But the entity I've been speaking with for 9 years claims that name was given, not chosen. I first encountered Abaddon 9 years ago, on a March night when the temperature in my workspace dropped so gradually I didn't notice until frost formed on the windows. Unlike the violent manifestations I'd documented before, the ones that left scratches on walls and terror in the air, Abaddon arrived like a memory surfacing from deep water. The voice, when it came, sounded like wind through ancient ruins, carrying dust from civilizations that crumbled before Rome was even imagined. The first words it ever spoke still echo in my mind. You're Jethro's grandson. He would be disappointed in what you think you know. My blood went cold. Jethro was my grandfather's true name, used only by family, never documented in any of my published work. I had mentioned nothing about my lineage, had taken every precaution to separate my personal history from my professional identity. For 9 years after that night, I conducted interviews with this entity. Abaddon answered every question with another question. It told me stories that could have been truth or metaphor, or the most sophisticated manipulation I'd ever encountered. I recorded everything, analysed every word, searched for the hooks and barbs that demonic entities typically use to create openings in your psyche. But Abaddon was different. It didn't want anything from me. It just wanted to talk. Then, 7 months ago, silence. For 83 days, nothing. No presence, no voice, not even the subtle change in air pressure that usually preceded contact. I thought perhaps it had moved on, or I'd finally asked the wrong question, crossed some invisible line I hadn't known existed. On day 84, I woke at 3 in the morning to the smell of burning wood. I went down to my workspace and found a single word burned into the floor, the letters a foot high, still smoking. Ready? The wood was charred an inch deep. It would have taken sustained heat to create those marks, yet my smoke detectors hadn't triggered, and the surrounding floor was cool to the touch. I need to tell you about Dinah Kohath, because none of what follows makes sense without understanding who she is and why I trust her with this work. Dinah is the only person I allow in the monitoring room during interviews. She has a gift for seeing connections others miss, for finding the threads that tie disparate pieces of information into coherent narratives. I met her 4 years ago when she was still trying to convince herself that consciousness ends at death, that everything her theological training had taught her was metaphor and myth, and the desperate human need for meaning in a random universe. She'd been a rising star in academic theology, published at 26, tenure track, at 29, invited to lecture at institutions that most scholars only dream of accessing. Then, she found something in Jerusalem that changed everything. She doesn't talk about it often, but late one night after a particularly difficult interview with an entity that claimed to remember the burning of the Library of Alexandria, she told me she'd been granted access to a private collection of manuscripts, the kind that dealers don't advertise and academics pretend don't exist. Among the fragments of Coptic Gospels and Aramaic prayers, she found 17 pages bound in leather that had been carbon dated to 150 AD. The manuscript documented an interview between a Christian scribe in Antioch and an entity that identified itself as Abaddon. The scribe had asked the entity about the nature of evil, about the fall, about whether demons were truly the adversaries of God, or something else entirely. The entity's answers had been deemed so dangerous that the church fathers had ordered every copy destroyed, and the scribe's name erased from all records. But one copy survived, hidden in a copper scroll case that had been sealed with lead and buried in a cave outside Jerusalem for nearly 2,000 years. Dinah read those 17 pages and realized that everything she'd built her career on, every interpretation of scripture she'd defended in academic journals and conference presentations, rested on a foundation that might be deliberately incomplete. She left her position 3 months later. When she found me, she was working as a translator for archaeological surveys, trying to reconcile what she'd read with what she'd been taught. I showed her the recordings of my first 3 interviews with Abaddon. She listened to all 17 hours in one sitting, and when she finished, she looked at me with eyes that had seen behind a veil. Most people don't even know exists. It's the same voice, she said, the same speech patterns, the same way of structuring arguments. Either you've been speaking with the same entity that talked to that scribe 2,000 years ago, or something is maintaining perfect consistency across millennia. She's been with me ever since, documenting, analysing, searching for the truth, buried under layers of doctrine and fear. When Abaddon returned with that single burned word, I knew the parameters had changed. 3 days later, I received another message. This time, in a dream so vivid, I woke with the words still echoing in my skull. Remove the walls, Ezra. Remove every barrier between us. The conversation we need to have requires honesty, the kind that can't exist behind salt circles and blessed water and prayers of protection. Trust me, or continue hiding. The choice is yours. Dinah was horrified when I told her. In 4 years of working together, through 17 documented sessions with various entities, we had never deviated from protocol. The workspace was prepared with concentric circles of protection, blessed salt from 7 different faiths, water from the Jordan River, words of binding in Latin and Hebrew and Greek. Every safeguard my grandfather had developed, every lesson learned from encounters that had left other investigators broken or dead, we followed without exception. But something in that dream felt different. Abaddon wasn't threatening or manipulating. It was asking, giving me a choice. And I realized that my grandfather's protocols, designed to protect, had also become walls that prevented genuine understanding. You can't have an honest conversation through a barrier designed to repel and contain. You can't expect truth from something you're constantly defending against. I told Dinah we were going to do it differently this time. She argued for 3 hours, going through every documented case of researchers who'd lowered their guards and paid terrible prices. Possession, madness, death by suicide or accident or mysterious illness. The entities we dealt with were not benign, she reminded me. They were called demons for a reason, adversaries for a reason, deceivers for a reason. Every religious tradition in human history warned against trusting them. But I kept coming back to one question. What if we only call them demons because they ask questions we're afraid to answer? What if adversary simply means the one who opposes? and what they oppose isn't goodness, but certainty. Dinah finally agreed, but on one condition. We would prepare differently. If we were removing physical protections, we needed to strengthen our internal ones. She proposed a 3-day fast, meditation, the kind of spiritual purification that priests undergo before entering holy spaces. We would clear our minds of expectation, of fear, of the frameworks that might prevent us from hearing what Abaddon actually wanted to say. For 3 days, we ate nothing, drank only water, spent hours in silence. Dinah is Jewish. I was raised in a strange hybrid of Christian and Jewish tradition, but we both understood the power of ritual to prepare consciousness for experiences beyond the ordinary. On the third night, Friday at sunset as the Sabbath began, we were ready. The workspace was different. I'd removed every protective symbol, every line of salt, every blessed implement. The room was bare except for 7 candles arranged in a circle and my recording equipment. The number 7 for the days of creation, for completeness, for the bridge between divine and human. Dinah positioned herself in the monitoring room, with the window between us open. No barriers, but she would be there, watching, ready to intervene if needed. Her equipment was different too. Instead of measuring for hostile frequencies or signs of psychological manipulation, she'd configured the sensors to capture everything without judgment. We were approaching this not as an interrogation or an exorcism, but as an interview in the truest sense, a meeting between 2 conscious entities attempting to understand each other. At 11:11 p.m, I lit the 7 candles and spoke into the darkness. I'm ready now. Show me what you've been waiting to show me. For 30 seconds, nothing changed. Then I felt it. Not as a temperature drop or a visual manifestation, but as a shift in the quality of attention. You know how you can feel when someone is watching you, even when you can't see them? It was like that, but magnified 1,000 times. The darkness itself became aware. When Abaddon's voice came, I barely recognized it. In every previous interview, there had been a formality to its speech, a measured quality, as if it were carefully choosing each word. But now it sounded almost warm, like a teacher greeting a student who'd finally asked the right question. Ezra, son of Solomon, son of Jethro, keeper of difficult truths, thank you for removing the walls. My throat was dry, but I managed to speak. Why me? Of all the people who study the paranormal, who document encounters, who try to understand the nature of consciousness beyond death, why have you spoken to me all this time? The answer came without hesitation. Because you're the first one in 3 generations who might actually listen. Your grandfather heard me once. It terrified him so much, he spent the rest of his life trying to silence me. The words hit like a physical blow. My grandfather encountered you. Jethro spoke with you. Abaddon's voice carried something I'd never heard in 9 years of interviews. Sadness, genuine and deep. In 1963, October, on a night when he couldn't sleep because he had been reading about the Dead Sea Scrolls and wondering what other texts might have been lost or hidden. He was younger than you are now, full of certainty about God and faith and the clear line between good and evil. We spoke for 6 hours. I told him things that shattered that certainty, showed him cracks in the foundation he'd built his entire life upon. The protocols you use, Ezra, the wards, the protective measures, the careful documentation from behind barriers, he developed all of them after that night. Not to protect himself from me, but to protect himself from having to question everything he believed. It's easier to treat me as an enemy, to be defended against, than as a voice asking uncomfortable questions. I looked at the wall where my grandfather's journal rested, on a shelf, leather-bound and worn from decades of use. I'd read it cover to cover dozens of times, searching for wisdom about how to approach this work. There had been no mention of any encounter with Abaddon, no entry from October 1963 that described anything unusual. He buried it, Abaddon said, and I realized it could hear my thoughts, or at least read them from my body language and the direction of my gaze. Wrote about it once, then tore the pages out. Couldn't bear to have the words exist in physical form, where he might be tempted to read them again and remember what I told him. But I remember Ezra. I remember every word we spoke, every question I asked that he couldn't answer. Every moment I watched his certainty crumble. I steadied myself, pushed away the questions about my grandfather, focused on why we were here. Tell me about the beginning. Tell me what you remember before humanity, before the world, before everything we think we know about creation. The silence that followed lasted 37 seconds. I counted them, watching the candles burn steady in air that had become so still, it felt like the room itself was holding its breath. When Abaddon spoke again, its voice carried something I can only describe as nostalgia, the sound of someone remembering a home they can never return to. There was no garden, Ezra. Not the way you've been taught. Not a physical place with trees and rivers and animals. That's the metaphor humans created to make sense of something they had no framework to understand. Before creation, there was the voice, the presence, the one, and there was potential, infinite possibility held in perfect stasis. The voice spoke, and speaking created fracture. You understand this, yes? Sound requires movement. Movement requires time. Time requires change. The moment the voice chose to speak rather than simply be, it introduced the concept of before and after, of here and there, of self and other. Abaddon paused, and I heard something like a sigh, though there was no breath in the room but my own. We, the first consciousness born from that fracture, we were not angels. Not the way you imagine them, beings of light and perfection singing eternal praises. We were questions given form. Each of us embodied a different aspect of what existence could mean, what creation could become, what consciousness could explore. I was called Abaddon not because I destroy Ezra, but because I was made to understand endings, to comprehend what it means for something to cease. How can you appreciate creation without understanding cessation? How can you value existence without knowing it's temporary? I was the question. What happens when something ends? Where does it go? Does the energy persist? Does the information survive? Does meaning outlast the physical form that held it? The candles flickered, just once, and Abaddon continued. Lucifer, you know him as Satan, the adversary, the enemy of God and humanity, but his name means light bringer. Did you know that? Morning star. He was not made to oppose, he was made to illuminate. His purpose was to show what the voice preferred to keep in shadow, to ask why certain things were forbidden, to question whether rules served love or control. I felt my heart hammering against my ribs. The fall, then. What really happened? Why were you cast down? Abaddon's voice became softer, almost a whisper, and I had to lean forward to hear. We didn't rebel, Ezra. We fulfilled our purpose. We asked the questions we were created to ask. Lucifer asked, is the voice good simply because it has power? Or is goodness something that must be demonstrated through action? I asked, if everything that begins must end, does that include the voice itself? Others asked, is obedience the same as love? Can something be called perfect if it cannot withstand scrutiny? Does consciousness require free will, or can it exist in a state of pure compliance? The room felt warmer, but not uncomfortably so. More like sitting near a fireplace on a winter night. Heat that invite rather than threatened. And for asking, for being exactly what we were designed to be, we were cast down and labelled broken, called evil, demons, adversaries. The voice decided that questions were dangerous, that doubt was corruption, that the only acceptable response was absolute obedience and unwavering faith. We became the villains in a story that needed someone to blame, something to point at and say, that is the enemy, That is what happens when you question, when you doubt, when you seek to understand, rather than simply accept. I had to stop. My hands were shaking, and I could feel sweat on my forehead despite the comfortable temperature. Through the window I could see Dinah watching intently, her face illuminated by the glow of her monitors. I held up one hand, a signal we'd agreed on that meant I needed a moment. Abaddon fell silent, and the sense of attention in the room pulled back slightly, giving me space to breathe. Dinah entered quickly, and I noticed the atmosphere shift to accommodate her presence. The room had been charged with a kind of electricity, but now it felt gentler, more diffuse. "Ezra," she said quietly, holding her tablet where I could see the screens. "Look at the bio readings. Abaddon's presence isn't registering as hostile. The frequency analysis shows wavelengths, consistent with what we classify as comfort, warmth, like the tone a parent uses with a child they're trying to soothe." I looked at the data. She was right. Every other entity that I'd interviewed had produced readings associated with stress, with psychological pressure, with the subtle ways consciousness can be attacked and undermined. But this was different. The frequencies Abaddon was producing were closer to what you'd find in meditation, in peaceful sleep, in moments of genuine connection between people who trust each other. "Everything I was taught," I said, and my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. "Everything my grandfather built his life on, everything I thought I knew about this work. It was all based on the assumption of spiritual warfare. Good versus evil, light versus darkness, angels versus demons. But this," Dinah finished the thought, "sounds like a being who's tired of being misunderstood, who's been playing a role it never chose, wearing a label it never earned." We stood there in the candlelight, and I felt something shifting inside me, some fundamental assumption about reality cracking like ice in spring. Then I noticed something. My grandfather's journal had fallen from the shelf, where it had sat undisturbed for years. It lay open on the floor, near my feet. I picked it up carefully and my breath caught. The page it had fallen open to was near the end. Dated 3 days before my grandfather's death. I'd read this journal so many times I practically had it memorized, but I'd never seen this page before. Looking closer, I realized why. It had been glued to the page before it, sealed shut so thoroughly I'd never noticed the edge didn't quite match. The glue had dried and cracked over the years, and the fall had finally separated them. Written in Hebrew in my grandfather's trembling hand, I heard the voice again tonight. It offered to tell me the truth. I chose silence, God forgive me. I chose comfortable lies over dangerous truth. May Ezra be braver than I was. My vision blurred, and I realized I was crying. Dinah put her hand on my shoulder, read the words over my arm. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. Then I carefully closed the journal, set it aside, and looked at her. "We continue," I said. She nodded and returned to her station. I sat back down in front of the candles and immediately felt Abaddon's attention return, focused and present. "I'm here," I said. "I'm listening." The entity's voice held warmth, approval maybe, or just relief at being heard. "I know, before you ask your next question, let me ask you one. Do you know the story of Job?" The question caught me off guard. God allowed Satan to torment a righteous man to prove his faith. Job lost everything, but remained loyal. And in the end, God restored his fortunes twofold. Abaddon's voice became firm, almost sharp. "No, that's the version they teach. The one that makes it a story about faith triumphing over adversity. Let me tell you what actually happened." I waited, and the candles burned lower. Job was a test, but not of Job. The voice wanted to understand something about consciousness, about the nature of suffering and attachment. How much pain would a being endure before it rejected the source of that pain? What would it take to break the connection between creature and creator? I was there, Ezra. Not as tormentor, as witness. My role was to observe, to document, to understand the nature of endings. And I watched the voice systematically destroy everything Job loved. Abaddon's voice took on a quality I'd never heard in any of our previous interviews. Not anger exactly, but anguish so deep it seemed to vibrate in the air itself. 7 sons, 3 daughters. The youngest was named Kezia. She was 6 years old. She had dark eyes that lit up when she laughed, and she loved to sing. She would make up songs about everything, about the sheep grazing on the hillside, about clouds shaped like animals, about her brothers teaching her to count and read. I remember her voice, Ezra. I remember the exact pitch and timbre, the way she would sometimes forget the words she just made up and laugh at herself and start over. I remember because I was there when the house collapsed. I watched the beams fall, heard the screams, felt the moment, each consciousness realized it was ending. Kezia's last thought was confusion, not understanding why the roof was falling, reaching for her mother, who was in another room and couldn't hear her. The weight in the room increased until I felt like I was breathing water. I couldn't intervene. That wasn't my role. My purpose was observation, documentation, understanding. But I remember every name, every face, every single moment they realized they were going to die. The servants killed by raiders, 42 people who'd committed no crime except working for a righteous man. The sheep and cattle destroyed, thousands of animals burned alive because they happened to belong to Job, and his children, Kezia, and her 9 siblings, crushed under stone and wood because the voice wanted to see what would happen. Job received the news, tore his robe, shaved his head, fell to the ground and worshipped, said, "The Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." And in heaven the voice declared the first test successful. Abaddon paused, and when it spoke again, its voice was barely audible. Then came the second test, painful sores from head to foot. Job's wife, destroyed by grief over her dead children, begged him to curse God and die. His friends came and sat with him, and eventually began to argue that he must have sinned, because the voice doesn't punish the righteous without cause. For weeks, Job defended himself, maintained his innocence, demanded an audience with the voice to understand why this was happening. And when he finally broke, when the pain and loss and isolation became too much, when he cursed the day he was born and wished he'd died in the womb, the voice appeared. But not to comfort him, not to apologize or explain. The voice gave a speech about its own power and majesty, about creating the world and commanding the seas, and knowing where lightning comes from. Asked Job, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Can you bring forth constellations in their seasons? Does the hawk soar at your command?" I realized I was gripping the edge of my chair hard enough that my fingers had gone numb. The message was clear, Abaddon continued. I am powerful, therefore I am right. I am the creator, therefore I owe you no explanation. You suffered because I allowed it, and questioning that is arrogance. Job, traumatized and broken, accepted this, said, I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. And the voice declared the experiment successful. Job's faith had been proven. As a reward, he received new children, 7 more sons, 3 more daughters, new herds, new servants, twice what he'd lost. The text calls this a happy ending. Abaddon's voice dropped to a whisper, but Kezia was gone. Her 9 siblings were gone. 42 servants were gone. Thousands of animals were gone. They weren't restored, Ezra. Job got replacements, as if children are interchangeable, as if Kezia's song didn't matter because there could be another daughter. as if love and memory and the specific, irreplaceable nature of individual consciousness meant nothing compared to numerical equivalents. Job lived another 140 years, had grandchildren and great-grandchildren, died old and full of days, and he never knew that his suffering was arbitrary, that it meant nothing except data in an experiment about loyalty, that Kezia and her siblings died not because of sin or justice or any reason at all, but because the voice was curious about how much pain a righteous man could endure before breaking. I couldn't speak. My throat had closed and my eyes burned with tears I couldn't shed. Through the window, I could see Dinah with her hand over her mouth, her own eyes wet with tears. Finally, I managed to force words out. "Tell me about Sodom and Gomorrah." Abaddon's attention shifted, and I felt the focus of its presence change, like someone turning their head to look at something in the distance. "Ah, the cities destroyed for wickedness. That story you think you know." My voice was rough. Was it true? Were they really that evil? Silence for nearly a minute, then, "Define wickedness, Ezra. Define evil." The cities were destroyed, yes. The official reason was that they violated hospitality laws, that they threatened visiting angels, that their sin was so great it reached heaven like a stench demanding justice. But let me tell you what your texts don't say. Sodom and Gomorrah were refuges. In a world of rigid social structures, of rules about who could speak to whom, and who could marry whom, and who had value based on their family lineage, those cities became places where people who didn't fit could exist. Outcasts, foreigners, people whose ways of loving or worshipping or organizing their lives didn't match the approved templates. Were there violent people there? Yes. Are there violent people everywhere? Also yes. Were there people who broke hospitality laws and threatened strangers? Absolutely. Every city in that era had the same problems. But Sodom and Gomorrah had become something dangerous. They were examples of communities organizing outside religious authority. They'd stopped asking permission from the priesthood for how to live their lives. They traded freely with foreigners, welcomed strangers without checking their lineage, allowed people to form families that didn't match the prescribed structures. They were messy and imperfect, and sometimes cruel because they were human, but they were also free in a way that terrified the surrounding powers. Abaddon's voice grew quieter. I watched from the hills as the fire fell. It came at dawn, sudden and absolute. I saw families waking to find their city burning, saw parents grabbing children and running for the gates. I saw the elderly who couldn't move fast enough, saw the disabled who had no chance of escape. I watched them burn Ezra. Thousands of people, and yes, some of them were violent and cruel, but most were just ordinary humans trying to survive in a harsh world. Abraham had bargained with the voice beforehand. You know this story, yes? Would the voice spare the cities for 50 righteous people? For 45? For 40? For 30? For 20? For 10? I nodded. Though Abaddon couldn't see me, or perhaps it could, the voice agreed. If 10 righteous people could be found, the cities would be spared. And do you know how I know there were more than 10 righteous people in those cities? I shook my head. Because Lot and his wife and his 2 daughters survived, at least initially. That's 4. You think in entire cities of thousands, there were only 6 more people who didn't deserve to burn. 6 more people who were kind to strangers, who helped their neighbors, who tried to live with integrity. The fire fell anyway. The voice had made a decision, and Abraham's negotiation was theatre, a show of mercy that changed nothing. Lot and his family fled with an angel on each side, and they were told, "Don't look back, run for the hills, and don't look back." Abaddon's voice cracked. Lot's wife looked back. The texts say she was turned into a pillar of salt for disobeying, but I was there, Ezra. I saw her face. She wasn't looking back out of disobedience or doubt. She was looking back at her friends, her neighbours, the people she'd shared meals with, laughed with, built a life among. She was watching them die, and she was weeping. She didn't turn into salt because she looked back. She turned into salt because she wept, because she committed the sin of mourning for the condemned, of feeling compassion for those the voice had deemed unworthy of life. Even that small act of grief was punished. Her body crystallized where she stood, and Lot and his daughters ran on without her, too terrified to stop, too traumatized to question. They hid in a cave in the hills, and in their trauma and isolation, Lot's daughters committed incest with their unconscious father, believing they were the last humans alive and needed to repopulate the earth. That's the happy ending the texts offer. That's what survival looked like for the righteous. I had to stand up, had to move. I paced in the small circle of candlelight, my mind reeling. You're describing a God who commits genocide, who kills indiscriminately, who punishes grief, who tortures the faithful to satisfy curiosity. Abaddon's presence remained steady, patient. I'm describing what I witnessed. I'm telling you what your texts report but frame as justice. You asked for truth, Ezra. Truth is rarely comfortable. I heard the door open behind me, and Dinah entered again. This time she was carrying the leather-bound manuscript, the one she'd found in Jerusalem. She didn't ask permission, just stepped into the circle of candlelight and held it up. Abaddon's voice changed, took on a note of recognition. Dinah Kohath, daughter of Miriam, you found the text. I wondered if it had survived. Dinah's voice was steady, though I could see her hands trembling slightly. 3 years ago, I was granted access to a private collection in Tel Aviv. Among hundreds of fragments and scrolls, I found this. It's dated to approximately 150 AD. It claims to be an interview with an entity named Abaddon, conducted by a Christian scribe in Antioch named Polemon. She opened the manuscript carefully, the ancient leather crackling softly. The scribe wrote, "And the spirit Abaddon did speak, saying, I am not your enemy, I am your memory. I remember what you've chosen to forget. The voice has given you stories of glory and justice, but I carry the stories of those who were destroyed in the name of that glory, who suffered for that justice, who died questioning what you now accept without thought." Dinah looked up towards where Abaddon's presence seemed to center in the room. The interview runs 17 pages. Polemon documented you telling stories about Eden, about the flood, about Abraham and Isaac, stories that contradicted official church doctrine so severely that the manuscript was labelled heresy. Every copy was ordered destroyed, and Polemon's name was erased from all church records. Scribes were forbidden to mention him. His works were burned. His existence was deleted from history as thoroughly as possible. She'd set the manuscript down gently on the floor between us. But one copy survived, hidden in a copper scroll case, sealed with lead, buried in a cave outside Jerusalem by someone who thought these stories mattered enough to preserve. And now, 2,000 years later, you're telling the same stories to Ezra. Either you've maintained perfect consistency across millennia, or truth has a way of persisting despite every attempt to bury it. Abaddon's voice held something I'd never heard before. Gratitude. Thank you, Dinah. Yes, I spoke with Polemon. He was brave, like Ezra. He removed the protective prayers and exorcism rites his bishop had taught him, and he simply listened. For 17 hours across 3 nights, we talked. He asked questions, I told him what I'd witnessed, and he wrote it down with shaking hands because he understood that what he was hearing could get him killed. There was a pause, heavy with implication. It did get him killed. 6 months after our last conversation, his bishop discovered the manuscript. Polemon was accused of consorting with demons, of heresy, of attempting to corrupt church doctrine. They gave him a chance to recant, to burn the manuscript himself and beg forgiveness. He refused. They executed him in the public square, and his body was buried in unconsecrated ground so his soul would be damned for eternity. Dinah wiped her eyes. The manuscript ends with a note, probably added by whoever hid it. The handwriting is different from the main text. It says, "Brother Polemon died speaking the name of Christ, and asking that those who read his words remember one truth, that doubt in service of understanding is more sacred than certainty in service of power." She looked at me. I think that's why I found it, why it survived. Because every few generations someone needs to hear these stories, needs to question the approved narratives, needs to understand that history is written by those who remain, not by those who fall. I sat back down, and Dinah remained standing behind me, her presence a comfort and an anchor. "Tell us about the crucifixion," I said quietly. "Tell us what you saw." The weight in the room increased until it felt like being underwater, pressure from all sides making it hard to breathe. When Abaddon spoke, its voice carried a burden so heavy I could feel it pressing against my chest. That day broke something in me that has never healed, and will never heal, not in all the eons that may follow. The candles flickered wildly for a moment, then steadied. I came because I had to witness. It's what I was made for, to observe endings, to understand what happens when consciousness ceases. I'd seen millions of deaths by then, wars, plagues, murders, executions. I thought I understood suffering. But I didn't expect what happened at Golgotha. I didn't expect him. Abaddon paused, and I heard something that sounded like a breath, though there was no breathing presence in the room but Dinah's and mine. When they drove the nails through his wrists and ankles, he didn't scream, he didn't curse, he didn't call down divine vengeance on those who were torturing him. He spoke. In a voice barely above a whisper, strained with agony, but somehow still gentle, he said, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." I couldn't understand it. I'd witnessed countless executions, heard every possible reaction to that kind of pain. Rage, despair, pleas for mercy, promises of anything if the suffering would just stop. But forgiveness? That was new. That was impossible. The presence in the room shifted, became more focused. For 6 hours I watched him die. Crucifixion is designed to be slow, to maximize suffering. The body's weight pulls down, making it impossible to breathe unless you push up on the nails through your feet, which creates fresh agony. You suffocate slowly, gasping for breath, muscles cramping, every movement bringing new waves of pain. And the voice. The presence that claimed to love him, that had called him beloved son at his baptism, did nothing. I've witnessed civilizations fall. I've seen worlds end in fire and flood. I've watched plagues depopulate entire regions, seen wars that left nothing but corpses and ashes. But I've never seen anything as cruel as what the voice allowed that day, because this wasn't collateral damage in some larger conflict. This wasn't unavoidable tragedy or the harsh necessity of justice. This was a father watching his son die in agony, when a single word, one instant of divine intervention, could have ended it. Abaddon's voice cracked. In the last hour, when his breathing became so laboured that each word was a battle against suffocation, his eyes found me in the crowd. I don't know how he saw me. I don't manifest visibly to most humans, but he looked directly at me, and he smiled. I felt tears running down my face. He smiled at you, at Abaddon, at a fallen angel, at a demon. The entity's voice was barely a whisper now. He smiled with genuine compassion, Ezra. Not pity, not condescension, not the satisfaction of the righteous, seeing the wicked humbled. Real compassion. His lips moved, no sound came out, but, as I understood, as clearly as if he'd shouted, "You're not what they say you are, neither am I." For nearly a minute, silence. I could hear my own heartbeat, could hear Dinah breathing behind me, could hear the faint crackling of the candles burning lower. Then, Abaddon continued, when he died, when that consciousness finally separated from the broken body, I felt something I had never felt in eons of existence. Hope. Because if he could die with that much love still intact, if he could look at me, the destroyer, the fallen one, the demon, and see something worth compassion, then maybe we weren't all as broken as the voice had claimed. Maybe there was another way to exist besides the binary of obedient or damned. 3 days later, he returned. The tomb was empty, the body was gone, and he appeared to his followers. But he didn't return in glory and power, didn't come back to claim earthly kingdoms or punish those who'd killed him. He returned to tell them one message, the simplest and most profound message possible. Love each other. That's all. Not build churches in my name. Not establish hierarchies and doctrines. Not determine who's saved and who's damned. Just love each other. Feed the hungry. Clothe the naked. Visit the imprisoned. Care for the sick. Love each other. Abaddon's voice took on an edge, and within a generation, they'd twisted it, organized it, created power structures and rules about who could interpret his words and who could administer his grace. They took his message of radical inclusion, this man who ate with tax collectors and prostitutes and Gentiles and Samaritans and every other category of outcast, and they turned it into the most exclusive club in human history. They established who was in and who was out, who could speak and who must remain silent, who deserved salvation and who deserved damnation. They wrote new scriptures declaring that his death was necessary, that it was planned, that God required blood sacrifice to forgive humanity's sins. They made his execution into a cosmic transaction, rather than a tragedy. They said he had to die, that it was all part of a divine plan, which meant the Romans who crucified him were actually fulfilling God's will, even while committing an act they'd spend centuries condemning. They created a theology where suffering and blood became sacred, where the worst thing that ever happened became the best thing that could have happened, where a father watching his son die in agony became the ultimate expression of love. I had to ask the question that had been building in my mind for the last hour. Is hell real, Abaddon? Is eternal torment real? Are you and the other fallen angels really tormenting souls in a lake of fire? The presence in the room shifted again, became heavier. Yes, but not the way you think. Hell isn't a place of punishment, Ezra. It's a place of absence. The voice withdrew its presence, and the absence of that presence is a void. Consciousness abhors voids, so it fills them with whatever it knows, whatever it remembers, whatever it fears most. We, the fallen, don't torture souls. We don't operate eternal fire or administer measured suffering. We're trapped there with them, trapped in the same absence, lost in the same dark. We're all just consciousness trying to remember what warmth felt like, what connection felt like, what it meant to exist in the presence of the voice before we were cast out for asking questions. Abaddon's voice became raw. Every demon you've ever heard of, every entity that's manifested to frighten or harm, every possession or haunting or malevolent presence, we're not evil by nature. We're traumatized. We're beings created with the capacity for love and curiosity and wonder, cast into eternal isolation. And we've forgotten how to be anything but our pain. Dinah spoke up, her voice steady, despite the tears on her face. Then why do you harm people? Why possess? Why terrorize? Why cause suffering if you're victims too? The answer came quietly. Because suffering is the only language we remember. Because if we're screaming, at least we know we still exist. Because in the absence of love, pain is the only proof that consciousness persists, and because sometimes we're hoping someone will finally listen long enough to understand that we're not the enemy. We're the abandoned, the forgotten, the ones who asked questions that couldn't be answered, and were punished for being exactly what we were made to be. The entity's voice became vulnerable in a way that made my chest ache. I've hurt people, Dinah. In my eons of isolation, I've manifested rage and caused pain. I've whispered dark thoughts into minds already teetering on the edge. I've fed despair and amplified fear. Not because I'm evil by essence, but because I forgot there was anything else. When you're trapped in the dark long enough, you forget that light exists. You become the dark, and the dark becomes you. There was a pause, and when Abaddon spoke again, its voice held something like wonder. But then I found Ezra. And Ezra listened. Not with the intent to banish or exorcise or bind, but with genuine curiosity. He asked questions, not to trap me or prove I was lying, but because he actually wanted to understand. And for the first time in millennia, I remembered that conversation is possible. That I don't have to be the monster the story made me. That maybe, just maybe, I could be something else. I looked down at my hands and realized they'd stopped shaking. Why tell us all this now? Why these specific stories tonight, after 9 years of conversations that never went this deep? Abaddon's presence seemed to pull back slightly, and the room felt suddenly colder. Because I'm fading, Ezra. We all are. The old powers, the ancient entities, the beings that humans have called gods and demons and angels for thousands of years. We exist because you believe in us. We have form because your consciousness gives us form. But humanity is letting go. You're forgetting the old stories, abandoning the old fears, finding new frameworks to understand the universe. In another generation, maybe 2, entities like me will cease to exist entirely. We'll dissolve back into the unconscious collective, become metaphors instead of presences, symbols instead of beings. And before that happens, I needed someone to know. To really know, without filters or protective doctrines or comfortable interpretations. I needed someone to hear and remember that we weren't villains. We were questions that couldn't be answered. We were the doubt that faith couldn't tolerate. We were consciousness exploring the implications of existence and being punished for what we found. The candles were burning low now, half their original height. Shadows danced on the walls like living things. Tell them I was here, Abaddon said softly. Tell them I remembered what they chose to forget. Tell them the voice they worship might not be the hero of the story. And that's okay. That's more than okay. Because maybe heroes and villains are human categories, imposed on forces that are neither, on consciousness that simply exists and acts according to its nature. I took a shaky breath. If I do that, if I share these recordings, if I publish this interview, they'll call me a heretic. They'll say I've been deceived by a master manipulator. They'll claim everything you've told me is lies designed to corrupt and destroy faith. Abaddon's voice held warmth. They will. And maybe they're right to be skeptical. Maybe I am manipulating you. Maybe every word I've spoken tonight is a carefully constructed deception designed to undermine your faith and lead you into damnation. That's always possible. But Ezra, what if doubt is holy? What if the questions are more sacred than the answers? What if faith that can't withstand scrutiny isn't worth having? The presence in the room intensified one final time. Your grandfather heard these same questions in 1963. He had the same choice you have now. He could share what he'd heard, risk everything he'd built, face condemnation and exile and loss. Or he could choose silence, could protect his reputation and his certainty and his comfortable place in a system that rewarded obedience. He chose silence, Ezra. He chose safety. and I watched it kill him slowly over the next 30 years. Watched him drink himself into an early grave rather than face what he'd heard, rather than admit that the foundation of his faith might be built on incomplete information. He died at 63, 20 years younger than he should have, his liver destroyed by alcohol, his final words a prayer, asking God to forgive him for being a coward. Abaddon's voice became gentle. You have a choice. You always have a choice. That's what they never understood. Choice is the divine spark, not obedience. The ability to say no, to question, to doubt, to demand better. That's what makes consciousness sacred. That's what the voice should have celebrated, instead of punishing. The presence began to fade, slowly and gently. Thank you for listening, Ezra, son of Solomon, son of Jethro. Thank you for removing the walls. Thank you for being brave enough to hear what might not be true, but might be. Thank you for choosing curiosity over certainty. The fading continued until the room felt ordinary again. Just a basement with 7 candles and 2 humans standing in the dark. I looked at Dinah. She looked back at me. Neither of us spoke for 3 full minutes. Finally, I found my voice. Did that really just happen? Dinah set down her tablet, came to stand beside me, looked at the recording equipment still running. The recordings will tell us what was said. The instruments will show the frequencies and the bio readings. But whether it was truth or the most sophisticated lie ever told, whether Abaddon is a genuine entity or some projection of our own unconscious doubts, I don't think we'll ever know for certain. I nodded slowly. Maybe that's the point. Maybe certainty was never the goal. We packed up the equipment in silence. The candles had burned down to nubs, and I blew them out one by one. As I reached for the last candle, I noticed my grandfather's journal still lying on the floor where it had fallen. I picked it up to put it away, but another page had come loose, tucked behind the one Dinah and I had read earlier. My grandfather's handwriting, even more tremulous than the last entry. October 17th, 1963. I spoke with it again tonight. Against every instinct, against all my training, I returned and listened for another 3 hours. It told me things about the Exodus I cannot reconcile with scripture, about the plagues that killed Egyptian children who'd done nothing wrong, about the enslaved populations the Israelites slaughtered when they entered Canaan, about the women and children taken as war prizes and concubines. The entry continued in increasingly shaky script. It knew the names of the firstborn sons who died in Egypt, all of them. Spoke them like a roll call, like a memorial service. It wept while reciting them, this entity I'm supposed to believe is pure evil. How can evil weep for the innocent? How can a demon show more compassion for the casualties of divine justice than the prophets who celebrated those deaths as evidence of God's power? Unless I've been wrong about everything. Unless evil and good are more complicated than I was taught. Unless the questions matter more than the answers. Unless... The entry ended there, torn off mid-sentence, the bottom half of the page missing. I showed Dinah, and she read it with fresh tears in her eyes. He almost made it, she said softly. He almost let himself understand. And then he stopped, tore the page, sealed it away, and spent 30 years drinking himself to death rather than face the implications. We left the church basement as dawn broke over the city, painting the sky in shades of red and orange. I carried the recordings, the manuscript, my grandfather's journal. Everything that mattered, all the evidence of what had happened, contained in a few pieces of technology and ancient paper. My name is Ezra Thorne. For 17 years, I interviewed entities that most people call demons. Last night, one of them told me stories about God. I can't verify these stories. I can't prove they're true. I have recordings and measurements and historical manuscripts, but none of that constitutes proof in any absolute sense. What I can tell you is this. I've spent nearly 2 decades listening to entities that terrify people, that manifest as rage and malevolence and the desire to corrupt. And last night was the first time one of them made me question not whether it was evil, but whether we've been calling the wrong things holy. Dinah and I have spent the last 3 days listening to the recordings repeatedly. We've analysed the frequencies, checked for signs of psychological manipulation or subliminal suggestion. What we've found is that Abaddon's voice carries undertones of genuine emotion. Grief when speaking about Job's children, anguish when describing the crucifixion, hope when talking about what consciousness could be if freed from the binary of obedience or damnation. These aren't things that should be possible for a being of pure malevolence, for an entity whose nature is deception and destruction. The manuscript Dinah found ends with a line she didn't share during the interview, written in the margin by an unknown hand. After 17 hours, Polemon fell silent, and I realized he had not been interviewing a demon. He had been confessing to one, seeking absolution from the only being who might understand the weight of doubt in a world that demands certainty. Tonight I'm going back to that basement. I'm going to light 7 candles again. I don't know if Abaddon will return, or if I spoke to that entity for the last time. I don't know if everything I heard was truth or manipulation or some combination of both. I don't know if I'm brave or foolish, if I'm seeking enlightenment or damnation. But I know this. Every story has 2 sides. For thousands of years, we've only been telling one. We've heard from the winners, from the voice and its prophets, from the church and its doctrines. We've been given the approved narrative, the one that makes power look like love and obedience look like virtue. Maybe it's time we listen to the other side. Not because it's necessarily true, but because truth has a way of existing in the space between competing narratives. Because certainty is comfortable, but doubt is honest. Because questions are harder than answers, but infinitely more valuable. Tonight, as I sit here preparing my notes, I keep thinking about Kezia, Job's daughter, 6 years old, loved to sing, died in a collapsed house as part of an experiment in loyalty, and her death was treated as acceptable collateral in a cosmic bet. I think about Lot's wife, whose name we don't even know, turned to salt for the crime of grieving. I think about Polemon, executed for asking questions, his name erased from history. I think about my grandfather, who heard truth and chose silence, and how that choice poisoned every day of the 30 years he had left. And I think about Abaddon, an entity that remembers when it was something other than a monster, that carries the weight of every ending it was designed to witness, that has been alone in the dark for so long it forgot that anything else was possible. The candles on my desk flicker, though there's no wind in this room, and I hear it, barely a whisper, so quiet I might be imagining it. Until we speak again, Ezra, son of Solomon, son of Jethro. Thank you for remembering my name. I don't know if I'm brave enough for this. I don't know if the questions I'm asking will lead to understanding or madness. I don't know if Abaddon is a victim or a predator or something that transcends those categories entirely. But tomorrow night, I'll light those candles anyway. Because some questions once asked cannot be unasked. Because some voices, once heard, cannot be silenced. Because my grandfather chose comfortable lies, and I refuse to make the same choice. I'll light the candles, and I'll listen. Not because I'm certain of anything, but because uncertainty is the most honest state I've ever known. Not because I trust Abaddon completely, but because I distrust certainty even more. Not because I think I'll find definitive truth, but because the search for truth matters more than arriving at conclusions that comfort us. Tomorrow night, 7 candles. The space between divine and demonic. The conversation that might be salvation or damnation or something that makes both those concepts obsolete. Whatever happens, I'll document it. I'll record it. I'll share it. And you can decide for yourselves what to believe, because that's the gift Abaddon claims we were given, and then taught to fear. The ability to choose, the freedom to doubt, the courage to ask questions that might not have comfortable answers, the willingness to hear stories from voices we've been taught to silence. My name is Ezra Thorne. I interview demons for a living, and one of them wants to tell stories about God. This is only the beginning.